Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our conference, Foreign Perspective, European Identity. I'm very glad that we really can have that conference, which is a part of the Hamburg-Vigoni Forum. The Hamburg-Vigoni Forum has been established nearly 2 years ago as part of the extra money which the university received when the university was granted the status of an excellence university. And we decided to use a part of that extra money for a European conference series. And one of these conferences is the Hamburg-Vigoni Forum. Within a period of 7 years, we would like to discuss the topics of sovereignty, of space, and of identity within Europe. And we would like to do that not only in the typical scientific perspective, but we also would like to do it in interaction and in very active exchange with politics. Of course, you can imagine that in particular in 2020, it was quite a hard year given the COVID-19 pandemic to get things going. And therefore we started to produce quite a lot of, little, videos with interviews amongst the scientists, between scientists and politicians about the topics of our conference. And we are very glad that this year, finally, we made it to the Lake Como, to Villa Vigoni, who is one of our cooperation partners. The other cooperation partner is the Hamburg-based Institute for Peace and Security Studies. So this year, we could enjoy beautiful sunshine in Italy and start the work. And we are very excited that we can continue today with that conference, and that by the end of February, we will have another event here in Hamburg with a guest of honor, which is the president of Latvia, Professor Levits. So I think an exciting row of events, and of course, one of the highlights is what we can do together today. Foreign perspectives on European identity is also at the very core of the conference that we have planned, of the whole conference series that we have planned, because we think it's not very helpful and not very smart if only the usual suspects, the Europeans, discuss amongst themselves what they believe their identity is, what they believe the relevance of sovereignty is, what they believe, how big the European Union should become. I think it's most interesting for the European Union and us Europeans to learn from outside perspectives, to learn from you, what you think about European identity and how these topics of identity, sovereignty in Europe are discussed in your legal cultures, in your legal communities. So a very exciting endeavor. And I'm thrilled that we can have it this afternoon. And I thank very much all those who helped to make it possible. Amongst others, the International Office of the University of Hamburg, my assistants at Europa Kolleg Hamburg, and of course, Mrs. Andraschko, who can't be here this afternoon, Mrs. Leptien from the International Office, who kind of, not only organized the conference in a technical way, but also gave quite a lot of inputs in the program, in the ideas, in who we could invite. So I think without any further ado, I'll hand over to Mrs. Leptien, and I wish all of us 2 exciting days of discussions and of insight. I thank you very much for taking your precious time to join. I know, after 2 years of pandemic, another Zoom meeting is kind of tiresome. Nevertheless, I think it's worth the while, and I'm all the more grateful that you all agreed to participate and that we can have a wonderful set of speakers sharing their views on Europe with us. Thank you very much. And dear Mrs. Leptien, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Professor, and also thank you for your kind words. Allow me to briefly introduce myself. So my name is Eva Leptien. I'm a policy advisor at the Department of International Affairs at Universität Hamburg, where I'm responsible for our strategic partnership management. I'm also representing the International Office of the Faculty of Law at Universität Hamburg. So also from my end, I would like to welcome our listeners from all over the world, and an extra warm welcome, of course, to our keynote speakers of this session and of all sessions to follow. Also, thank you. Universität Hamburg works very closely with international networks and an international network of strategic partner universities around the globe. And we're particularly happy to have so many universities from our network and beyond present here today. That's truly reflecting global collaboration in research. So on behalf of the International Office of the Faculty, we're excited and also a little bit proud to have gathered such a diverse and high-profile speakers for this conference, and we're curious to hear about everybody's perspectives on European identity. You as listeners will of course also have the opportunity to comment and to ask questions. In order to do this, I would like to ask you to use the Q&A button that you see at the bottom of your screen. There's also a chat function that you can use to chat amongst each others if you'd like. I would also like to use the opportunity to thank the team of the conference, first and foremost, my colleague Merle, Andrashko, but also Kalina, Jan-Hendrik, Martin, and of course you, Professor Kotzur. We also generously received specific funding for this conference from funds of the Excellence Strategy through the Department of International Affairs. However, without further ado, I think it's time to dive right into this first session on the EU as an international actor, classifying statehood and justifying state behavior. Now, what are we trying to do with this? In 2009, with the Lisbon Treaty, the EU has introduced a new institutional setup. While increasing the European Parliament's legislative powers, provisions regarding the EU's role on the international level were also added. The EU was now granted full legal personality, and it was enabled to conclude international agreements and also join international organizations, quite much like nation states do. What we would like to discuss with our keynote speakers today is whether these changes have increased statehood or the perception of statehood, whether the EU's ability to, so to say, speak with one voice have strengthened the EU's role as a global player. How does this affect the international playing field and the role of the EU? And can we consider the European Union as a state-like actor, or is it perceived as such in the international community? Well, to help us discuss and gain perspectives on the described topic, I would like to introduce you to our panelists, or to our speakers. First of all, we have Professor Henk Botha. He teaches legal philosophy and interpretation of enacted law at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He has previously taught constitutional law. Prior to joining the law faculty at Stellenbosch University in 2006, he was professor of constitutional law at the University of South Africa. His fields of specialization include constitutional theory, comparative constitutional law. Thank you for coming, Professor Botha. Secondly, we have Professor Niron Liu. She's an associate professor of European studies at Fudan University in Shanghai. She holds a PhD in sociology and a Master of Arts in sociology, computer science, and history of art from the University of Bonn in Germany, as well as a bachelor's in journalism from Renmin University of China. She was, amongst others, visiting researcher at the Center for European Integration Studies in Bonn, that was in 2009, and visiting researcher at the German Council on Foreign Relations in 2016. Her research interests include Sino-EU relations, German studies, as well as EU-China-Africa trilateral relations. I would say a perfect fit for this session. Thirdly, we have Professor Chin-peng, who currently serves as Vice President of National Donghua University, as well as professor at the Department of Public Administration at Hualien in Taiwan. He is director of the European Union Research Center at NDHU and holds a Jean Monnet chair. He holds a PhD from the Institute of Political Science at Justus Liebig University in Gießen in Germany, and graduated from the Institute of European Studies at Tamkang University in Taipei. From 2009 to 2012, he served as Minister of Research, Development and Evaluation Commission of the Executive Yuan. Now, once again, welcome, thank you, and we're looking forward to your talks. I will lead you through this discussion, and please, audience, feel free to ask questions, to participate, and to discuss. I will now hand over to Professor Botha. May I ask you to start, please?
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking Professor Kotzur for the very kind invitation. honored and thrilled to be part of this panel, and also the rest of the team, Mrs. Andrashko and others, who have been extremely helpful and who displayed really incredible attention to detail. Thank you. I must say I found the framing of this session quite interesting, what I particularly liked was the focus on the statehood of the EU. I know at some stage it was more it was kind of more conventional to talk about the EU as displaying a kind of governance without the state. It might also be tempting just to refer to the EU as a supranational kind of organization, or something between a state and a supranational organization. But I think it is great that the topic of the statehood of the EU is put on the agenda. I think what this suggests, and quite rightly so, is that despite all the talk about the weakening of state powers, the erosion of state sovereignty and the like, the state is still considered the paradigmatic instance of an independent international actor. Okay, so what will I do? I will start with by saying something about South African perceptions of the European Union, or at least my perception of South African perceptions of the EU statehood. Then I will say something about how I think the European project in certain respects resonates, and in other respects does not resonate with the South African experience. And if there is still time left, if there is not, please stop me. I will say something about how we classify entities as states or state-like actors. Okay, so I'm not aware of any studies that have been done on South African perceptions of the statehood of the EU. I came across some studies on South African perceptions of the EU as a collective actor in foreign aid and trade and so on, but I don't think those studies are directly on point here. So what I did instead was I spoke to a few colleagues, I spoke to a few friends, I even spoke to a family member. So you can see that I followed a very rigorous methodology here. And the reactions were interesting, and I think the reactions were also quite mixed, which is good. So some of them came out quite strongly and said, yes, we think the EU can be considered a state or state-like actor. Typically, those would point to the EU's areas of shared competence and exclusive competence. They were saying, these look like state powers. One of my colleagues also pointed to the EU's competence in migration. The fact that the EU has the ability and the power to take decisions on migration, and in other words, that it can set boundaries. It can include, it can exclude. And in this respect, I think it is interesting to contrast that with the African Union. Now, of course, the African Union also has a migration policy framework. It also has conventions, the protocol on free movement, and so on. At the same time, the African Union's agency on these matters is restricted quite a bit by state practice. There's a huge gap between these policy documents and actual state practice. And also, I think by the fact that some of the biggest states, including South Africa, increasingly over the past few years have looked at migration as a security matter, rather than an economic development matter, which is not very helpful. And also many of these policy documents in the African Union are not quite enforceable. They are non-binding. Okay, so on the other hand, I picked up some hesitation among colleagues about the EU statehood. And I must say, their reasons were not articulated quite as clearly. So I had to do a little interpretation. And first of all, it seems to me that in the South African popular consciousness, the EU is still seen, or the EU as an international actor is still seen more as an economic actor rather than a political actor. So the EU is associated with trade agreements, economic relations, and so on, whereas heads of state and the governments of Germany, France, and the other European states are seen as the political actors. This probably doesn't stand up to scrutiny, but it is a perception nonetheless. Secondly, I think in South Africa there is also a perception that the EU is a supranational organization. Perhaps one of the reasons for this, well, it's a supranational organization more than a state. I think one of the reasons for this may be that the Lisbon Treaty and the treaties that preceded it were adopted by European states rather than by the people of Europe or by a constituent assembly representing the people of Europe. Okay, and of course this view I think resonates with a number of views that were expressed quite clearly in Europe and also by very respected constitutional lawyers and judges in Germany, I think at the time of the debate about a constitution for Europe and afterwards. And then thirdly, it seems to me that there is to some extent still a perception in South Africa that the EU may be a legal entity but not a political unity, as it lacks one of the basic requirements of statehood, namely a unified people. Okay, so I think that is one of the cultural assumptions underpinning how we look at statehood. Okay, let me just say, add a few possible responses to these reasons why the EU may not be regarded as a state-like entity. It seems to me, as an outsider, that the EU is a profoundly political entity to the extent that it elaborates foundational European values. It establishes European citizenship, of course. It establishes powers, exclusive powers and shared powers. And in other words, the EU includes and excludes, like states do, like political entities typically do. They include certain states while excluding others. They include certain populations while excluding others. They include certain values while excluding others. Okay, and I think some legal philosophers in Europe have also pointed out that in any event, all constitutions are established through acts of representation. So it may be misleading to think of states being established through directly by the people through exercises of constituent power. What typically also happens in a state is that a constitution is drawn up by a political elite. Sometimes that elite may be elected, and that afterwards their decisions are legitimated through the popular vote or through popular acceptance. Okay, so my final point here, I think from where I stand, and of course I'm saying all of this with some trepidation because I'm not a European constitutional lawyer, but from where I stand, it seems to me that stating that the EU is state-like does not yet say anything about its legitimacy. And I think exactly the same applies to nation states. You can recognize something as a state, but you can still have reservations about the its legitimacy. So to the extent that there may be problems of a democratic deficit in the European Union, that is of course something to be addressed through institutional reform, through dialogue and so on. But on the basis of that, to conclude that the EU is not a non-state actor does not seem to me very helpful. And I think it can also obscure the extent of the EU's powers. Okay, so let me say something about the resonance of the European experience with the South African experience. To start with, I think it is important to point out that in many respects, South Africa and I think most other countries in many other countries in Africa are still caught up to quite a significant extent in a national frame. South Africa is still building state institutions. It is still trying to come to terms with the injustices of colonialism and apartheid, and more recently also state capture under the Zuma administration. There is a real attempt still to integrate different ethnic and cultural identities into a more encompassing South African statehood. And I think it's important to note that because as a result, South Africans make certain assumptions about the links between statehood, cultural identity, and the nation state. Okay, but despite the strangeness of the EU from a South African perspective, I think it still to some extent resonates with experiences in South Africa. And I think it does so both in a negative and in a positive way. Now, negatively speaking, democratization in South Africa more or less coincided with the end of the Cold War, the Washington Consensus, international insistence on trade liberalization, marketization, and so on and so on. And that had a profound impact on the scope of South African politics and the economy. So there's a very real sense among many South Africans today that attempts to liberalize our economy at the time that it was done were harmful and had devastating consequences for South African industry and the economy and so on. And of course, that's not directly related to the European Union, but I think to some extent, the European Union is just such a global phenomenon that to some extent it has become almost a metaphor for processes of globalization and multi-level governance, and perhaps in a negative sense, kind of faceless processes of governance. Okay, but I think importantly, there are also positive associations, and for many South Africans, the EU represents a beacon of hope, and it also overlaps in our consciousness to some extent with our own experience, because it represents an attempt to move away from ethnic conceptions of statehood, government, and citizenship. And it also signals the possibility of transnational dialogue, transnational decision-making on issues of common concern, cooperation, and even possibly strengthening democracy by having multiple levels of democratic accountability. Okay, so if I have another few minutes left, I will just say something very briefly about how we think about states, how we categorize things as states or state-like. And of course, statehood is an unstable term. I think particularly in present times, in a time of growing interdependence and complexity. But as I have indicated before, it still seems to remain the paradigm, possibly because we simply lack an alternative vocabulary. Determining statehood, I think, is complicated by a number of factors, because there are different dimensions of statehood. There are legal and institutional dimensions. There's the cultural dimension, or the identity dimension, which is also one of the themes of this conference. And then many people would also say that a popular sovereignty and democratic self-government is linked to statehood, at least on certain perceptions of it. But it seems to me that when we discuss statehood, we do not necessarily apply in a mechanical manner some legal definition or some abstract definition or set of defining properties. What we do rather is we make a situated judgment through which we assess whether new political and legal formations show a familiar resemblance with the state, which is kind of the prototype of an independent international actor. One could even say a family resemblance with a prototype of the state. And I think what is exciting about this is that through these conversations, our understandings of statehood and sovereignty themselves may change. And I think we are already seeing that. We are rethinking our assumptions about statehood, sovereignty, and the like, which is, in my view, an exciting development. Okay, I think I should probably stop right there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Botha, for your interesting talk. To the audience, if you have questions, yes, first of all, of course, an applause. Please post them in the Q&A window, and I will get to all the questions after we're done with all the talks. I would now like to hand right over to our next speaker and continue with keynote number 2 with Professor Lirong Liu.
Yeah, hello everyone. I need some time to share my presentation. Yeah. Can you see it? Yeah. You can also hear me. Okay.
Yes, everything works.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Lirong and I come from Fudan University in Shanghai. Thank you for inviting me to this conference and for giving me the opportunity to talk about the European identity from a Chinese perspective. Sorry. My talk will be in 3 parts. The first part is introduction. I plan to say a few words about the role of the EU in the world, In the second part, I'm going to analyze the status and role of the EU in China's foreign policy. In the third part, I'll try to discuss the limitations of the EU as an international actor from a Chinese perspective. Now let's move to the first part of my talk. As an international actor, the European Union is unique with its economy, population, and market size. The EU is a global actor, but unlike the United States, China, Russia, and other major actors, the EU is not a state. The EU has a plurilateral structure of governance and civil policy means promoting universal values and standards in the surrounding regions and beyond. The EU's borders can also be continuously expanded through enlargement process. There are different notions or discussions about the role of the EU in the world, such as civilian power, normative power, military power, ethical power Europe, or model power, a benign actor or geopolitical power. In Chinese view, the EU is an important economic power and a global or regional normative power. Based on the policy practices, the dominant feature of the EU's international identity is still an economic power. As a normative power, the EU exerts influence mainly in its neighboring regions and individual countries. In comparison to foreign and security policy, the EU has more continuity in trade policy. In the second part, I would like to analyze the status and role of the EU in China's foreign policy. The multipolar world, the multipolar vision has been an important element of China's European policy over the past 7 decades. A united and strong Europe as a credible global actor has been considered a positive factor for the implementation of China's independent foreign policy. During the Cold War, China improved its relations with Europe to counterbalance the dominance of the United States and the Soviet Union. In the post-Cold War era, the EU has been regarded as China's important partner in the promotion of multipolarity. In the last 20 years, the Chinese government has issued 3 policy papers. The notions of the EU's international role have been changed. In 2003, China issued its first EU policy paper. The paper indicated that China should attach more importance to the EU as a whole. The release of the policy paper coincided with a series of significant advances achieved within the European integration. Beijing hoped that the EU could play an increasingly global role in international economy, politics, and security. It now appears that this view might have been too optimistic. In 2014, China released its second EU policy paper. In this document, the EU's strategic importance in international affairs has been further affirmed. Although Euro area economies were affected by the global financial crisis, but the EU, quote, continued to be a global player of great strategic importance and a key part in the evolving international landscape, unquote. In 2018, Chinese government issued its third policy paper on the EU. In this document, the description of the role of the EU is relatively simple and plain. Quote, the European Union plays a strategically important role in the international arena, unquote. Brexit is a retrogression of the European integration. As a result, the political, economic, and military power of the EU are inevitably weakened. Beijing is relatively disappointed with the role of the EU as an independent global actor. Next, I would like to change direction and discuss the importance of the EU as a market power. According to the realist theory of international relations, power is an important factor. The ability to shape the agenda depends on the political and economic power of the actors involved in the negotiation. The larger the economy, the greater the operating space for financial capital. The greater the attractiveness of market access, the greater the potential market power. Yeah, in the last 20 years, China's economy and its share of global good trade have increased rapidly. The gap in relative economic power between China and the EU has been gradually shrinking. As shown in Figure 1, from 2002 to 2019, the EU's share in world imports fell from 17% to 14%. China's share increased from 5.7% to 13.4%. As shown in Figure 2, from 2002 to 2019, the EU's share in world exports dropped from 18.9% to 16%. China's share increased from 7.5% to 16.7%. After Brexit, the EU's share in the global economy and world trade will further decline, and the EU's bargaining power in trade negotiations will also be weakened. Although the relative economic strength between China and the EU is gradually approaching, but concerning market power, the EU still has certain advantages. As shown in Figure 3, during the period from 2002 to 2019, the 28 EU countries have a long-term trade deficit with China and a long-term trade surplus with the United States. Although China and the EU have disputes over the causes of trade imbalances, however, based on the trade data, the EU market is far more important to China than the Chinese market is to the EU countries. As China's largest trading partner and the largest export market, the EU has relatively stronger market power. This is also an important reason why the EU maintains a strong posture on issues such as granting market economy status to China or creating a free trade area between the EU and China. Yeah, economic and trade cooperation has long been and remains the basis of Chinese-EU relations. As a result, China's policy toward the EU concentrates on cooperation on economic, culture, and technological matters. China considers the EU to have a limited role as a global actor, judging from the internal coordination problems seen in the repeated failure to develop a credible common foreign and security policy. Even when the EU does act, for example, in crisis management, it does so almost exclusively in areas surrounding the EU or its traditional spheres of influence, such as Africa. As far as East Asian security is concerned, the EU and its member states have so far played no active role. In China's view, the EU embraces the role of a civilian power, while its members continue to relegate hard security issues to NATO. In the third part, I would like to discuss the limitations of the EU as an international actor from a Chinese perspective. There are 5 things to consider. First, the role of the EU as an international actor overlaps with some member states. The limited role of the EU is partly determined by itself. Both the EU and its member states can act as international actors. EU member states are allowed to act outside the EU framework. For example, Germany, France, Italy, and the EU are all members of the G20. On the loyalty of some EU member states, the EU has to compete with the United States. Beijing attaches also great importance to developing relations with EU member states. It has been discussed whether Beijing should pay more attention to the EU member states as they tend to a pragmatic foreign policy. Second, the foreign policy decision-making of the EU is characterized by lack of continuity. The EU has a plurilateral structure of governance. Due to the lack of political solidarity and clear international strategy, the EU's role as global actor has often been questioned. In the past 2 decades, the guiding ideology of the EU's security strategy has changed, namely from effective multilateralism to principled pragmatism. The focus of the EU security strategy has been adjusted from expansion to self-protection. The third point, as a civilian power, the EU does not have sufficient military capability. With its economy, population, and market size, the EU is a global actor. However, in contrast to the global ambitions of the United States, the EU is mainly concerned with its surroundings. The EU pursues strategic autonomy. However, the EU's approach to defense integration has not essentially changed the huge power gap between it and NATO. Due to lack of political will to act together, it is difficult for the EU to become a fully influential global actor. Since the refugee crisis in 2015, the surrounding environment of the EU has deteriorated. For the EU, the focus of its foreign policy is no longer to export its own democratic model, but to emphasize its own and surrounding security. The next point, the EU's influence as a normative power has gradually declined. The EU believes in its attractiveness and seeks to export governance model to neighboring countries. Since 2008, the EU has experienced a series of crises on issues such as rule of law, good governance, and integration. The unity within the EU faces many challenges. With the intensification of global geopolitical competition and setbacks in transatlantic relations, it is difficult for the EU to maintain its identity in the international system. The last point, the disunities within the EU weaken its foundation as a model power. Unlike the United States, China, and Russia, the EU's interests are not clearly defined. In the process of responding to the crisis, the EU's institutional flaws and differences in the interests and values among member states have shaken the principle of unity in diversity, which followed by the EU in the integration process. The EU itself can hardly be regarded as a model of unity and cooperation. On the recent dispute over Poland's rejection of European Court of Justice rulings, German Chancellor Merkel pointed out that it is the question, quote, "It is the question of how the individual members envision the EU. It is an ever closer union, or is it more nation state?" As can be seen from above discussions, in the last years, European integration has been impacted by various crises. The EU's relative weight in the global economy is declining. Nevertheless, from the perspective of global standard setting, the unified large market owned by the EU is still an important power in maintaining global standards and rules. Since the multilateral trade negotiations have been in trouble, the EU tries to use its dominant position in bilateral trade agreements to promote the EU's agenda, standards, and values, and finally realize the transfer from bilateral to multilateral. As this figure shows, the EU has launched a series of trade agreements with many countries worldwide and is negotiating with many others. With its trade power, the EU could impose domestic constraints on other trade partners. Economic power helps to improve the EU's ability to shape its external environment. Finally, I'd like to end with a summary of the main points. China's vision of a multipolar world shapes its views of the EU. In Chinese views, the EU is an important economic power and a global normative power. Although the relative economic strength between China and the EU is gradually converging, but concerning market power, the EU still has a certain advantage. In recent years, under the influence of Sino-US rivalry, the EU has faced pressure to choose sides. In Chinese-European strategy, the EU presents an important power in the multipolar world. Beijing attaches importance to EU's pursuit of strategic autonomy, a united, strong, and open Europe that is a credible global actor suits China's interests. Yeah, that concludes my talk for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your great presentation. Very interesting points that you presented there. I would like to now hand over to our third keynote speaker, Professor Chin-peng Chu. I believe you're also sharing a presentation.
Yes, thank you very much. I will share my PowerPoint firstly.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to this event. So today I will talk about the EU, Asia, and the questions of the identity, about the power and influence of the European Union. I come from Taiwan, National Donghua University in Hualien. So it's my great honor to be here. And I would like to share about the three main points today. The first point is about the source and elements of the European identity. And the second, we are talk about the regionalism in the European integration and how it influenced to the Asia. And the third part, it's regard to the normative power, soft power, and its influence on China case. And then I make some conclusions. For the introduction, I would like to start with identity of the European Union. It's a multi-layer concept, but it still lacks clarity. For EU insight, we know that there are some of the European countries. For European countries, let's say of some of the European countries not the member states of the European Union. And also, the other third countries is another partner or strategic partner for European Union. And I will start with what are its source and the foundation of the identity. And under concepts of the power and the influence, what will be changed about the self-perception and the perceptions of the European Union and the other countries in Asia. And then I will talk about the European identity in evolution since the foundation of the European Union. This is shaped by European integration process. And then, however, different connotations of identity were shaped by a changing global context and domestic dynamics inside the European Union. Okay, today, under von der Leyen's Commission of the EU, the most relevant connotation is concerning about the geopolitical European Union in search of a geopolitical identity. And European Union image in the world, there will be the soft power in Europe versus in China. And what the Asian perceptions of the European Union or European identity in Asia. So this PowerPoint will be to explain what role does the European Union play in the world and what role does it want to play. That will be discussed in this occasion. Secondly, I would like to talk about the source and elements of the European identity. So in the very beginning of the 1950s, the Robert Schuman, he taught Europe needs a soul, an idea, and a political will to serve this idea. Until today, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in 2021, and she taught to the public, as I look back on this past year, if I look at the state of the European Union today, I see a strong soul in everything that we do. And we did that together. We did that together as the Commission, as a Parliament, and as the 27 member states, and as one Europe. And we can be proud of it, but I believe that it is when you are tasted that your spirit, your soul, truly shines through. As I look across our union, I know that Europe will pass the test. So this is a very important to be a signal that the European Union identity today with narrative inspired by self-confidence, showing unity, but in reality, there are many differences between member states. Even so, but self-perception, self-confidence is need to be able to project influence and to be proved. How does Europe see itself in the world? Second, about the source of the European identity from the legal foundation. The EU founding values is concerned about the human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, the respect of the human rights, including the rights of the person belonging to the minorities. And the European Union's objective is concerning about the European Union contribute to the eradication of the poverty and the protection of human rights, in particular the rights of the child, as well as to the strict observance and the development of international law, including respect for the principle of the United Nations Charter. So this means also very important for the principle of the European Union at the heart of the EU identity. That means it is united in diversity. And by means of the power and capacity to project influence, the EU always tries to shape international discourse and effort to tackle global challenges at the core of the European integration process. Let me continue to the elements of the European identity. The European identity at first, constructed and discursively shaped by European elites, a supranational concept to create a system of supranational actors, the common European Union institutions. Today, member states worry their national sovereignty is affected by supranational institutions. So let me track to in 1973, that's where we introduced about the identity. That is a declaration on European identity. And member states highlight common heritage and their common interest. But seeking cooperation, coordination, coherence, but challenging to coherence because of currently the internal fragmentation. Just taking case of the urbanism in Hungary, for example. And also some of the challenges, labor of the trust of the citizen in the EU project. And it has given the impression of the fragile. The third part of today's is concerning about regionalism and European integration versus Asian regionalism. First, concerning about the political integration and the reconciliation in Europe began with the European economy integration after centuries of the war and conflict. This is a very important background. Under the Franco-German reconciliation, but today, the European Union is fully integrated politically and economically with a common market, a common currency, and a common foreign and security policy. But integration did not happen overnight. This is a gradual process over 70 years. The regional integration for the European Union is the so-called the EU's hard integration based on the politically set arrangement. When we are looking at Asian nations, it's reluctant to embrace EU-style integration, or we instead pursue the strategy of the open regionalism, or maybe in the Asian countries, we call that the soft regionalism and open integration. They are coming together when it fits their own interest. And open integration in the Asian style embrace concept of the loose and the pragmatic integration. But it is excluding legally binding decisions that constrain action in key policy areas. So when we compare with Asia and Europe, we found that the EU integration was accompanied by an institutionalization process. Institutionalization and institution building not considered beneficial in Asian context. They are fierce institutions which oblige governments to give up sovereignty in key policy areas. Unlike the European Union, the ASEAN, for example, acts according to the principle of non-interference in internal affairs of its members. And this principle formulated in the Asian Charter is Asia's key principle, specifically limiting the association influence on member states' policy making. But now today, the EU on a global stage, as an international actor, internally complex, fragmented with a multi-layer governance system, but is seeking to converge, and externally operating through a dialogue, trade cooperation, cultural exchange, and people to people. But for Asia, and for Asia countries, the EU remains remote, inaccessible, complicated, but attractive as an integration model. Like ASEAN, while the EU is fully integrated, but Asia still lags behind in economic and political integration. Given different cultural background and history, it is wrong to compare the success of the EU integration process with less integrated Asian countries. The EU-style integration does not set the standards by which Asian integration can be measured. But EU integration and identity should instead inspire Asia, even they are so different in economy, culture, and social and political convergence. The third part of the this part is Europe, Asia, Pacific, Indo-Pacific. How Europe connect Asia Pacific. Undoubtedly, in an interdependent world, the Europe and Asia are key players. In the year of 2019, the EU announced connecting Europe and Asia, building blocks for an EU strategy. The EU emphasized for both EU and Asia, growing global interdependence is an opportunity for increased cooperation, for peaceful political cooperation, fair and stronger economic relations, comprehensive societal dialogue, and collaboration on international and regional security. So the European way is this word sustainable, comprehensive, and rules-based connectivity. activity. This is the next part to explain with normative power. The normative power, identity and influence of the European Union to the world is a diffusing norms, the respecting norms at home and the promoting them abroad. The EU promotes 9 norms: sustainable peace, the freedom, democracy, human rights, rule of law, equality, social solidarity, sustainable development, and good governance. But according to Manners, in the year of 2002, the EU's normative power is leading by themselves. Example, it is a diffusion of the norms results from the unintentional diffusion of ideas from the European Union to other political actors. And other actors of the world polity will want to copy its behavior and take it as an example. For example, in the ASEAN in the 1967, ASEAN took the European Union integration as a model for their own organization. That means the one vision, one identity, one community, promotes intergovernmental cooperation, facilitates economy, political security, military, and educational integration. And low sphere over effects to the world for exploration of this regionalism is quite clear. Now, I take the case of the China to speak out about the identity and influence of the European Union. We know that in the year of 2016, the Chinese President Xi Jinping instructed the state-owned China Global Television Network to tell Chinese and China's story well. Xi Jinping's ambition to increase the China's international discourse power and augment the nation's comprehensive national power. When we compare the both, the EU's normative power is about the bottom-up soft power, the versus Chinese adversary diplomacy, maybe to say like the top-down soft power or maybe hard power. And this is a perception of the China will be deteriorating, especially after COVID-19 crisis. So according to Xinhua report, the presidency said that a shift visible in the year of the 2021. He told the world, we must focus on setting the tone right, be open and confident, but also modest and humble, and strive to create a credible, lovable, and respectable image of China. I meant that under Xi Jinping's word, the Beijing seeks to promote an authoritarian governance model as opposed to democracy. Xi Jinping seeks to project influence and shape language as Europe and the United States have through their soft power, and China's image has been damaged as a result of the aggressive language and behavior, and this is counterproductive. This should be continued to observe. Lastly, I make the conclusion remarks of today's presentation. Firstly, the EU as a geopolitical identity on the global stage. When we look the words of the EU High Representative Joseph Borrell in 2020, he told the world, this should be this year that Europe gets traction with a geopolitical approach, as keeping the faith of the being a player in search of its identity. And she continued to say that EU has the option of becoming a player, a true geostrategy actor, or being mostly the playground. Especially this was under US-China geopolitical rivalry. So in consideration of a changing global context, dominated by the great power rivalry, poverty, international terrorism, race for technological leadership, climate change, and global health crisis, and so on. The most important question is that what role can the EU play to shape global development and shape discourse? With its power and influence, can European Union work with like-minded partners in Asia to promote democracy? And the other question is, how can the European Union use the concept of the European identity as an asset to play a constructive role for international in a changing global context dominated by the great power rivalry? So that is very important now for today's European strategic autonomy that we mentioned. European Union on the world stage should be cooperate to secure peace and the rules-based order. But for the past decade, in particular, following the 2008, the financial crisis and with China's rising, the Brexit and the unpredictable Trump presidency, and the EU started focusing on its sovereignty through its foreign policy. The capacity to act be less dependent on the United States and not to be caught between US and China. So this is the strategic autonomy means that protect the European way of life and self-image as a role model. Normative power now replaced by defensive attitude and the lower ambitions and more narrow regional focus. So these tendencies has affected how Asia seek Europe. Is more self-absorbed, even more distant, or less involved. So the lastly is about the European Union image inside of the EU. The new Pan-European survey conducted by European Council for Foreign Relations shows that after COVID-19 crisis, there has been a rise in public support for unified EU action to tackle global threats. And European acknowledge that they are alone in the world. Their perception of the United States, China, and Russia have worsened. And Europeans still believe in the value of the cooperation, but fewer EU institutions have not helped them enough during the crisis. So the last word is solidarity should be reassessed. This is my presentation today. Thank you for you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Well, that was very interesting. 3 perspectives, 3 different countries, 3 different perceptions, I believe, also of the European project, if you want to call it that. Now, I would like to one more time encourage our audience to use the question and answer button that is at the bottom of your screen to ask questions or just comment too, if you wish to comment on our speakers' presentations. You're welcome to do so as well. Before we get to the audience, I would like to loop back to our speakers and see if you had specific comments about each other's presentations, or even if there was anything that surprised you possibly about the presentations. If there's a main difference that you noticed that you maybe from your culture background would like to comment on or point out. Now, Professor Botha, is there, would you have a comment for us?
Okay, so while listening to the other 2 presentations, I thought about some of the differences in the relationship with Europe between Africa on the one hand and Asia on the other. My sense is that with Africa, there has been perhaps a somewhat more relationship of dependence also because of the colonial heritage until not that long ago. So that, for instance, the institutions of the African Union are in many respects modeled on the institutions of the EU. How they work in practice, of course, is a very different matter. But when you read some of the literature on perceptions, for instance, within the Pan-African Parliament on Europe, on the one hand, there's a kind of dependence on European ideas and so on. So European ideas have really helped to shape the discourse in Africa around possible African integration. But on the other hand, I think there's also a great reluctance because people start saying, well, we shouldn't follow Europe too blindly. There's a bit of skepticism sometimes about European motives. It's so in a sense, it's still, I think, the legacy of colonialism speaking. And my sense is that is quite different in Asia, where you have real superpowers who are on a much more equal in a much more equal kind of relationship with Europe. That's just a perception. If anybody would like to follow up on that.
Thank you very much. Now to our other two speakers. Are any comments from your end, Professor Liu?
Okay, I'm pleased to say that we have the same perception from China and Africa. I think the EU is mostly an important economic power. I'm also pleased to see Professor Chu has also the same observation. I think the security strategy from the EU in the last 10 years has changed from expansion to self-protection.
Yes, thank you very much. And now, yeah, please go ahead, Professor Chu.
Oh, thank you. I think that is very interesting that when I hear the presentation of the Professor Botha about African people to see how they think the EU model. And for me, it's quite interesting question is because the EU and African in geopolitical situation is quite close. And how this, because you know that you mentioned also the African Union, things that I think that after the maybe 20 years ago, so will be built. And there are some of the regional integration also in the African states. Some of the African states, regionalism, maybe successfully follow up the European Union's model. For example, the Western African states. So the Western African states is not like the African Union, because African Union is the whole African countries to build a union, and they do have an idea, but too many countries and too many members in an union, and some of the different kinds of the regional, for example, the West African state, for example, is much more successfully. So how to be explained for the whole African states in the northern parts or southern parts and the western parts and even the eastern parts, they are quite different kinds of the type of the regionalism. So how the African people to sit and to understand that the EU model could be successful or not. Yeah. And for China, I think Professor Liu has quite very clearly to explain that about China, the perception to the European Union model. And also in Taiwan, 20 years ago, we do have also a very popular statement especially our former President Chen Shui-bian in the year of 2001. Actually, President Chen Shui-bian, he is a pro-independent state for Taiwan. But in the year of 2001, he announced officially take the EU model, EU integration model, as a model for cross-strait relations. That means that between mainland China and Taiwan could be a good model under the EU experience, integration experience. So that's quite a very interesting. But the most important issue for both, or maybe it's an obstacle, is the sovereignty issue, because all the members of the EU are the independent sovereignty states, and this is a nation state. Taiwan is quite different for mainland China. I think all the world to know. There's also the question of or definition of the one China policy. For example, the EU said that we have we do have a wish. We wish to have a closer relations to China, to Taiwan, but under one China policy. I think that another question is one China policy and one China principle. What is the difference between both? I think there will be key significant role in the following future of the relations between Taiwan and mainland China, and also could be create a model for the international community for both. But this is this is also very difficult. It's quite difficult for both, because all the democratic partner, all the democratic alliance, for example, in these 2 days, the Joe Biden, United States, U.S. President Joe Biden, they call for a summit for democratic countries will be take place, and Taiwan will be invited this summit. But Singapore has been excluded. I don't know why. So this is quite complicated for international arena, and but actually in some words, or in one word, that sometimes, and 20 years ago, this is quite a good model for Taiwan to discuss EU model for cross-strait relations, because this is a higher economy cooperation and a higher economy integration, according to the Balazs's economy theory. So, and hopefully, the both sides, Taiwan and mainland China, could be create a common market for both sides. So I think this is a good thing. But sovereignty issue could be solved. I think this is also is a dilemma for both sides. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for your comments. And Professor Chu, you're raising a lot of very difficult questions there, I believe, too. So we have our first question from the audience, but we also have a raised hand from Professor Kotsua that I would, of course, like to acknowledge. So please, Professor, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for the excellent keynote presentations. And, you know, before we come into the other audience questions, I really abuse my position here because I find so exciting what you said. And I'd like to have two questions. The first one in particular addressing Professor Botha, because you said something which is quite striking. You said that the statehood-like thing of the European Union can also be addressed to the very fact that the Union has the power to exclude and include. These inclusion-exclusion dichotomy is something which is very typical of a state, of statehood. And I find it quite interesting because there are quite a lot of debates about, you know, inclusiveness and exclusiveness of the European Union. And I'd be keen on you to elaborate a bit further on that inclusion-exclusion aspect. And to all three speakers, and in particular to Professor Chin-peng Chu and Lirong Liu, you know, listening to your presentations, even though, of course, you had very different accent, you know, I could hear some kind bit of a story of decline, you know, if you look at the role of Europe as a normative power, as maybe a global role model. And I think that's a very careful and very reflected analysis. And my question would be, you know, we are always also in Europe talking about the reasons. Why is there that decline? And I could hear a bit, and that would be my question to you. Is it maybe also the fact that, you know, the Europeans are a bit too much concerned with themselves? You know, we always claim that we want to be a global power, we want to be a global actor, that we want to be taken seriously by the big ones. You know, we develop, and I'm a bit provocative now, we develop all these fancy strategies with, you know, cooperation with Asia and cooperation with African countries and so on and so forth. And in these strategies, we pretend as if we were really a global power. But on the other hand, we just are very concerned and busy with ourselves, you know, with our internal problem. And sometimes I'm afraid that the European Union is a bit seen as, you know, that big guy who tries to develop muscles, but is way too concerned with internal affairs and how to do that, you know, discussing with the trainer and everything. And on the outside, nothing happens anymore. And I'd really be interesting, you know, the story of decline you defined and you saw, I think rightfully so. Does it also have to do something to do with the very fact that we Europeans are just too concerned with ourselves? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think the first part of it, or the first question, went out to Professor Botha, so I would like to ask him to reply if he likes to.
Yes, thank you. It's always interesting to talk about inclusion and exclusion, I cannot profess too much expertise within the Europe context. But one can think of a few typical examples where inclusion and exclusion become quite significant. The one is in allowing new members, in deciding which members will be accepted. I think the debates about Turkey, for instance, come to mind. Of course, that raises a whole number of cultural issues and identity issues as well. How open is Europe to states that have a different political tradition, that may have a different religious tradition, and the like. But then, secondly, of course, also there's the question of populations, of people who are allowed in Europe, and there the refugee crisis comes to mind, a whole number of questions of migration, but also what some people refer to as internal exclusion. Again, it's probably not my place to raise these issues here, but my sense is, just as my own country is really battling with internal forms of exclusion, where a majority of Black people still live in squalor and poverty, and still, even though they have formal citizenship, still do not have substantive citizenship. And I think there are probably parallels in Europe where people have been there for a number of generations, but they are still deprived of citizenship in the full sense of the word. Yes, so I think what is important to my mind is that the EU has really important decision-making powers in this regard. Of course, a number of these types of exclusion play out at the national level, but nevertheless, the EU has very important has a very important role in setting agendas and making policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Now the second question, I think, was for everyone now.
Lady first.
Yeah, thank you. I can speak something. I think European Union is a very important actor in the world. A strong Europe meets also China's interests. Before the financial crisis, I think China helped the observation of China, of the EU's role in the world is relatively optimistic. But since 2008, the EU has experienced a series of crises, particularly the refugee crisis in 1915, and the EU pays more attention on its surrounding area. So also after Brexit plays also an important role. So China considers the EU to have a limited role as a global actor, also judging from the internal coordination problems in the common foreign and security policy.
Okay, I think I follow Lirong statement. Thank you for Professor Kozua to raise some question to. I think this is a governance crisis or governance failure of the European Union. Things that in the year of the 2004, after referendum, failure of the European Convention or European Constitution. Firstly, the failure on the French referendum and then Dutch. I think since that, this is a very, this is a milestone for EU's political integration. And since that, the Lisbon Treaty in the year of the 2009, it's a very important milestone for the currently of the further integration of the European Union. But you mentioned also that the populism, I think since of in the year of the 2011, there are so many quite a different kind of the parties in the different kinds in different member states of the European Union has the same problem, the populism. For example, the rising of the urbanism in Hungary, and until now, 10 years, they are the ruling party in Hungary, and there will be some of the democratic recession in this country, and now maybe to spread to the Poland. So I think this is also a very important internally of the European Union's crisis, and the COVID-19, for example. So there are so many. It's quite difficult to deal with. So we listen that the von der Leyen's statement and the Borrell of the High Representative of the Foreign Minister, for example. So they call for unity of the European Union. And in the global community, there are some of the challenges. For example, the great powers, the United States and China's trading war, and affecting to the European countries. And the international and regional crisis, for example, in the Asian countries, we do have another problem. And the other, for example, the China, the 70+1 or 16+1, one Belt, One Road project is now quite a challenges. So from the past, the partner for strategic partnership between the mainland China and EU, but now has been the transfer to the maybe a systemic competitors. So I think everything is changing. So I hope that should be very carefully to deal with internally problems in the EU. Inside of the EU is much more important than the outside of the EU. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Botha, is there anything you would like to add about question number 2 from Professor Kotsua?
No, not really. I do find it a fascinating and an important observation that the EU has become more internally focused, but I think as far as I'm concerned, the other 2 speakers have dealt with it very well.
Okay, great. Thank you. I find it very interesting that I think all 3 of you have brought up powers with regards to migration, or some of you refer to it as the refugee crisis. I think that's such a great example of Europe acting as one, but not acting as one at the same time, kind of showing that split personality and the internal, discussions that Professor Kotsua pointed out also. But now I would like to go to our Q&A question that comes from Professor Repkin. He thanks everybody for the very interesting keynotes and has the following question. So the lack of unity among the member states was mentioned several times as a decisive factor for the weakened external impact. What do you think about the importance of law in creating unity?
I've talked a lot the lack of unity among the member states. In comparison with the nation state like United States or China, I think the unity of the EU member states is very important. And I haven't done much research on the EU law. Just to give an example, the EU has a plurilateral or polycentric structure of governance. For example, the EU's foreign and security policy are made by 28 sovereign states following unanimous principles. It leads to inefficiency of EU foreign policy making process. That's an example.
Thank you very much. Any additional perspectives on the relevance of the law for forming unity in Europe or elsewhere too?
If I can say just 1 or 2 things very briefly, I do think law has a very important role in legitimating power, sometimes in normalizing power. But of course, there are different kinds of law, and there are different theories about how law can possibly legitimate power. And I think when it comes to different types of law, you have law with a strong binding effect, but then you also have this minute kind of regulatory type of law. And the question is, and I don't have an answer to that, do you need a very strong democratic basis for law in a region such as the EU in order to have this kind of normative power and to legitimate the status quo and to legitimate new developments, or is it sufficient to have a regulatory kind of regime, often referred to as governance, which is not backed up by such a strong democratic basis, but which regulates in great detail certain affairs. That's more of a question than an answer.
Thank you very much. Yes, Professor Kotsua, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I may also briefly reply to Professor Botha's answer, because I think that's a very exciting and interesting point, because in Europe that integration through law theory is very big and very strong. But I think you made quite an important point if we talk about the question whether we can create unity or even identity by law, and that's the issue of legitimacy. And if we look at the early beginnings of the European Union, I think the legitimacy issue was not the most present one. It was rather, as you said, about a regulatory regime from a functional point of view, you know, all these functionalist integration theories. You want to establish a common market, which is now the internal market, and you want to make the market run, and therefore you need a legal framework. And I think at least in the early days, the integration through law theory was also a bit more narrowly aiming at the very idea of, you know, creating a market. And maybe one could also contrast that, you know, great quotation by Professor Chin-peng regarding Robert Schuman, Europe needs a soul, needs identity. And Walter Hallstein's answer is, you know, the European communities at that time, they are a community of law, a creation by law. And I think, you know, for a citizen, the word, okay, we need law, or we need a soul, these are really different worlds, you know, because you're not talking about identity and soul and that kind of, you know, feeling of belonging in legal terms. And I think that is the big issue, and straightforward, you addressed the very point. Once, you know, law is to create legitimacy of a more complex political entity, I think many Europeans ask the question whether that, you know, legitimacy function by a constitution or a constitution-like order that also should be based on something like a sense of belonging. And that also kind of, you know, connects to your inclusion and exclusion aspect, because, you know, included shall be those who want to belong to the European Union. And that's also interesting, who feels kind of, you know, belonging to the Union as a Union citizen or something like that. And that also would be my question maybe also to the other panelists, you know, whether, you know, from your country's perspective, the European legal framework is more seen from a functionalist point of view, making integration possible, or more from the big legitimacy issue that, you know, that legal framework is really addressing the very constitutional questions of legitimacy, of, you know, constitutional rights, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Before I would hand over to answer that question, thank you for pointing out the sense of belonging to Europe, or as a European citizen, also the sense of belonging to the EU as a citizen. If we look at a very classic definition of what a nation state is, or what statehood could be, we always include a permanent population as being part of the criteria for defining statehood in international relations theory. And that permanent population, of course, per passport may exist, but it may not exist per identity so much. So although we all have German European passports, we may not feel fully European, but possibly more German than European. This may not apply to everybody, but that sense of belonging and identity does differentiate, I think, between nation state a little bit and whatever you want to call the EU, a quasi-state or a supranational organization, or so. Now, I'm just looking, were there any replies or comments to what Professor Kotsue said from our speakers? Otherwise, we do have another question that was posted in the chat.
Could I just react?
Of course.
Yes, I think wonderful points. Citizenship, as I've always seen it, is first of all a legal category rather than a cultural category. Of course, citizenship tends to be infused with certain cultural identities through political movements and through nationalism and so on. But I would like to think of citizenship as primarily a legal category which allows us to bind different people together in a single political entity, and in the process to provide for a diversity of opinions and expressions. Now, of course, that does not answer the question of belonging, and a sense of togetherness and so on in itself. But I think the democratic answer to the question is probably that through democratic institutions and through democratic participation and through more active forms of participatory democracy, citizenship could start to play that role. You know, connecting strangers to one another, even though they do not necessarily share the same religious or cultural or linguistic identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unless there's from the speakers anyone else, I will go to the question in the chat, which is actually fairly long, so allow me to read it. It is from a colleague from Tver University, State University in Russia, I believe. The question is, what is European identity? I think that fits very nicely what we were just talking about. When we're talking about Europe, we consider all European countries in Europe. For example, looking at football and football championships, that would include Russia and Turkey as well. But if we look at the European Union, we would exclude those countries. So we have the Europe and European Union difference here. And secondly, European identity is the Schengen countries. So we have a further division of the European continent, the European Union and the Schengen countries, the Schengen area. Why is there so much identity conflict in Europe? And the African Union includes all African countries, and the same in the African Confederation football. Why is that not the same in Europe? So an identity crisis was pointed out here. That's an interesting point, and very great lines drawn, I think, within those different identities. Are there any comments on this this question from Tver University? Yes, please, Professor Tu.
It is a long question and many questions. Maybe a short response. I think for the European identity, so I'm talking about the European, we consider all the country in the European example for European football. Okay, that's very interesting. I think for identity, it's just like people, for European people, awareness. Okay, so what is awareness as a European? What is the definition for European? And what is the definition for European policy? And what is the European passport? The European Union is not the organization including all the European countries, but the European Union has the idea to unify all the countries that they recognize the value or the identity of the European Union together. For example, after the Cold War, since the year of the 1990s, so the Central and the Eastern European countries, they do a lot of the political reforms, and they do have a longer negotiation to join the European Union. And a lot of the reform, before a lot of the reform and before the join of the, for example, the Central and the Eastern European countries to join the European Union as a member state, they have a Copenhagen criteria. All the member states should follow up the principle of Copenhagen criteria. So this Copenhagen criteria is under all the consensus. Is not only the principle, is all the member states should be follow the principle. So I think they create this value, this common value as a European community, as a European identity. I think this is very important. So just take another example. for Turkey membership. The Turkey membership as a candidate membership, it's finished negotiated in the year of 2005. But since that, until now, it's 16 years past. And the Turkish membership is not yet achieved or to join the European Union. So I think it's not only the consensus of the Copenhagen principle, but also any kinds of other problem. For example, the religious culture maybe, or the human rights problem maybe should be solved before you as a member state in the European Union, because you have to follow up the European value which create in the very beginning of the war, the end of the war, the Second World War, until the Cold War, at the end of the Cold War. So I think this is very important background to understand. And the other, I should be response, is very important issue that the institutionalized arrangement of the European Union, because there are three institutions as a co-decision institution. It is a mixture of the supranationalism and intergovernmentalism. So intergovernmentalism, for example, the Council of Ministers in the European Union stands for the national interest, and European Commission stands for the supranational level, and European Parliament, it stands for the people. How could be these three institutions could be have a common value and a common decision to create a common identity? This is very important, and this is what I mean. This is institutionalized weaken in the character of the European Union. So that's my response to the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Actually, after European enlargement in this process in 2003, I really believe, yeah, as long as a country accepts EU values and accession conditions, every country can join the EU. It's also a very interesting argument on the reconstruction of the European values. Professor Niron Liu from University of Munich once argued that the value orientation of Europe could go back to the ancient Greek culture. That means the European value could beyond religious consensus and opens up unlimited possibility for the EU's future eastward expansion and extension to the south of Mediterranean. But after the crisis since 2008, something has changed here. It's fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Kotsur.
I would also like to add from a European perspective that question is really very interesting and exciting, because you rightfully criticize that we talk of European identity, even though we do not aim at all European states. You know, that identity debate we are focusing at within the European integration context is more or less the identity of the member states of the European Union and the European political union. I think it's very important. It's very, very important to keep that in mind. I would like to add that, you know, the identity of broader Europe, the identity of all the other states that are also part of the European Union, is relevant for our discussions and debates. However, we also need to be very aware, as both Professor Chin-peng and Professor Lirong Liu said, that not all European states would like to join the European Union. The Brexit is a wonderful example that the former member state has left the Union because the integration was too strong. The integration was too kind of, intensive. That's something they did not like. Therefore, they wanted to leave. They wanted to go. That's one very important argument. And the other important argument, there are some member states who cannot leave, who cannot join the Union because they do not fulfill the requirements. They do not fulfill the Copenhagen standard and the Copenhagen criteria. That's also a very important argument. And that's a point I'd also like to stress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Botha, please go ahead.
Thank you. It's a fascinating question. I think from an effectiveness and a functional perspective, there are limits to trying to be as inclusive. For instance, the African Union has tried to be. Perhaps it was one of the strengths of the European Union that it originated with, I think, how many, 6 members, and gradually expanded. And I think that links up with some of Professor Chu's previous comments about different regions in Africa. So because Africa is a vast continent, geographically and also in terms of the numbers of countries in Africa. And it seems to me that in certain areas, the African Union is starting to realize that the only way of achieving integration is actually through sub-regions, such as those for the Western African states or the Southern African states or the Eastern African states. At least in the area of freedom of movement, that seems to be the case, where these principles are introduced on a more and implemented on a more sub-regional basis.
Thank you very much, Professor. So let me see. Okay, we're all out of questions and we're also almost all out of time. That works really well. Now, let me try. I'm not going to be able to summarize the past 2 hours, but let me try to name a few keywords that have stuck with me. We saw that, or we looked at the discussion whether Europe can be, or the EU actually, can be considered a state or a state-like actor. And I think it has become clear that from an international perspective, from your perspectives, that is not quite the case. We would not consider statehood as a descriptive term for the European Union at the moment. Rather, it is an economic power, an economic actor with certain political factors to it, obviously. We discussed the EU and European identity, or EU identity, as we should have said, probably. Mm-hmm. We looked at creating legitimacy through law, creating unity through law, and integrating the European continent through law and policy. We've seen that the EU as a whole is very complex, and Professor Chu, you pointed that out in your presentation, where you described an Asian view of the EU as being remote, complex, and complicated. I think that describes it quite well in certain regards. So thank you very much for that. We also identified that for the EU to have a permanent population and fulfilling one of the state definitions, nation state definition criteria, we would need a stronger sense of belonging for European EU citizens to the EU and not just their home country. And it was also mentioned that citizenship allows us to bind people to a certain identity, but it doesn't create that identity necessarily. So I would give you the opportunity to say one last sentence, if you would like, very much just a sentence. We have 2 minutes left. If you want to opt out of this, that is okay too. Let's do the round again. Professor Botha, your last sentence for this.
I think I've said too much already, but it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Liu.
Yeah, I think a strong Europe meets China's interest. That's all.
Thank you. And Professor Chu.
Yes, thank you very much. A lot of learn from by each other and from European. One Europe, one world, and unify together.
Very much so. Thank you very much. And Professor Kotsua, let's include you too.
I'd like to thank everybody for these wonderful insights. I think the panel also already gave proofs, you know, how fruitful a conference like that is, that, you know, we Europeans, you know, learn from, you know, outsiders who are very much insiders. There's not a world of outsiders and insiders, so maybe only of insiders, that we learn quite a lot, and we are most grateful, not only for, you know, the progress of our conference. I also would like to thank you on behalf of Mrs. Lehrmann from Villa Vigoni and Professor Schröder from the Institute for Peace and Security Studies. We learned quite a lot that will be very helpful for our proceedings, but I think also for the big overall discussion on the future of European integration. Thank you very much for that input, and I'm looking forward to, you know, meeting as many of you as possible again in half an hour. If you see Professor Weiler from NYU and Professor Salzberger from Haifa University.
Also from my end, thank you very much. What an exciting discussion, very interesting input from your end. And I hope we get to meet in person at some point in our lives. For the time being, Zoom has been great. Thank you for coming. Also to the participants, thank you for participating. We will take a short break and continue with our second session. Come back, log in using that same link that was provided, and follow more interesting discussions. All right, thank you so much and goodbye.